The year 1943 marked a desperate turning point in the colossal struggle on the Eastern Front. The German Wehrmacht sought one final, decisive victory to regain the strategic initiative lost at Stalingrad. The enormous Soviet-held bulge, known as the Kursk salient, became the chosen stage for this high-stakes gamble. Operation Citadel, the plan to pinch off and destroy the Soviet forces within the salient, was intended to be a masterpiece of armored warfare. Hitler and his high command believed a successful, powerful armored thrust could destabilize the entire Soviet defense. They amassed a fearsome concentration of power, including the new and potent Panther and Tiger tanks, for the monumental attack. However, the Soviet command was not ignorant of these preparations, having received timely and accurate intelligence regarding the offensive's intent. The months leading up to the battle were not spent in quiet waiting but in a frenzied, unprecedented construction of defensive lines. The Soviet engineers and millions of civilians dug into the earth, creating one of the most formidable defensive systems in military history. This defensive effort involved multiple echelons of trenches, anti-tank ditches, artillery positions, and deeply layered minefields. The very landscape around Kursk was transformed into a deadly labyrinth designed to consume the finest armored divisions the Germans could field. The delays in the start date, primarily for the arrival of more new tanks, only granted the Soviet defenders more time to perfect their lethal traps. It was into this environment of mounting tension and monumental construction that one of Germany's greatest armored commanders was dispatched. His mission was a final inspection, a critical assessment of the readiness and prospects for the impending clash of titans. The summer sun beat down on a landscape pregnant with the destructive force of hundreds of thousands of buried explosives. General Oberst Heinz Guderian stood as the living embodiment of the blitzkrieg doctrine, a visionary who had reshaped modern warfare. His name was synonymous with the lightning campaigns that had shattered Poland and overrun France with terrifying speed and decisiveness. He had long argued for the primacy of the tank, advocating for its use in concentrated, independent armored thrusts rather than dispersed infantry support roles. This foundational belief in rapid, mobile warfare made him instinctively wary of any frontal assault against prepared, static defenses. By 1943, Guderian held the influential position of Inspector General of the Panzer Troops, a role focused on the production, training, and deployment of Germany's armored forces. He was not directly in command of the divisions preparing for Operation Citadel, but his technical expertise and strategic insight remained unparalleled. His relationship with Hitler was often strained, marked by Guderian's blunt critiques and unwavering focus on military realism over Nazi ideological fantasies. He was a man who understood the mechanical and human costs of armored warfare better than nearly anyone in the German high command. Guderian knew that the precious new tanks, the Tigers and Panthers, were a finite resource that could not be easily replaced. He viewed Operation Citadel not as a necessary blow, but as a potentially fatal drain on the panzer forces that were needed elsewhere. His concern centered not merely on the strength of the enemy but on the fundamental attrition that a massed, conventional attack would surely inflict. He feared that this operation would commit the German army to a battle of fixed positions, a style of warfare that negated the very principles of his doctrine. Guderian's journey to the front lines was driven by a professional necessity to see the ground truth for himself, to gauge the reality versus the optimism of the planners. He carried the weight of history and the future of the Panzer Arm on his shoulders as he drove toward the Kursk salient. The architect of rapid movement was about to witness a defensive network designed solely to bring all movement to a complete and shattering halt. The forces arrayed for Operation Citadel represented the apex of German military concentration on the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge commanded Army Group Center, poised to attack the northern face of the salient. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein led Army Group South, prepared to strike the southern face in a massive coordinated pincer movement. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns, stood ready to execute the largest tank battle in history. The air buzzed with suppressed energy, a tension that precedes any massive offensive when the final orders are awaited. The German troops, many of them veterans of years of brutal fighting, understood the scale of the task ahead. Intelligence reports, while acknowledging the strength of the Soviet buildup, often underestimated the sheer depth of their fortifications. The planning hinged on the new heavy tanks breaking the initial lines and the subsequent exploitation of the breakthrough by the panzer divisions. This was a commitment of nearly all available operational armored reserves, a gamble that would leave little margin for error or counterattack elsewhere. Every delay in the offensive's launch had been a gift of time to the Soviets, a tactical advantage that was compounding daily. The German military machine was poised like a coiled spring, awaiting the command to unleash its kinetic fury across the open fields. Guderian's mission was crucial because his assessment carried significant weight regarding the long-term viability of the panzer force. He was not there to fine-tune the attack but to evaluate the fundamental risk to the core armored components of the Wehrmacht. The summer landscape of Russia, deceptively peaceful, concealed the vast machinery of destruction that both sides had labored to prepare. The sheer mass of men and material indicated that the battle, when it finally began, would be a ferocious and costly affair for all involved. The Soviet response to the anticipated German attack was a masterclass in defensive engineering and doctrine. They did not simply dig a single line of defense but constructed a staggering, interlocking system of resistance that ran many miles deep. This defensive zone was comprised of three main protective belts, each supported by reserves and an intricate network of supply lines. The density of the fortifications defied previous German experience on the Eastern Front, demonstrating a new level of Soviet preparedness. At the core of these defenses were the anti-tank minefields, laid in concentrations that were both numerically massive and strategically sophisticated. The Soviets employed both anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, creating mixed fields designed to demoralize and slow down the assault elements. Some sectors had mine densities exceeding 2,000 anti-tank mines and 2,500 anti-personnel mines per kilometer of front. These were not just randomly sown explosives but carefully placed obstacles funneled toward pre-sited killing zones for artillery. The minefields were coordinated with heavy anti-tank artillery units, creating a deadly combination of explosive barrier and suppressing fire. Once the German tanks were immobilized by the mines, they became easy targets for the concealed Soviet anti-tank guns and tank destroyers. The layered approach ensured that even if one belt was breached, the attacking forces would immediately run into another, equally dense layer of obstacles. The goal was less about holding a specific piece of ground and more about bleeding the German armored divisions dry. The Soviet command sought to attrit the enemy's strength so thoroughly that any breakthrough would be Pyrrhic, lacking the force for deep exploitation. This vast defensive undertaking represented a significant national effort, a testament to the grim determination of the Soviet Union to defend its territory. The earth itself became a weapon, transformed into a continuous, subterranean field of lethality that awaited the advancing German steel. Guderian's inspection journey brought him directly into the immediate proximity of the massive Soviet defensive works. He was a general who preferred the raw truth of the front line to the sanitized briefings of the rear echelon headquarters. His inspection was thorough and rapid, characterized by a brisk impatience to assess the situation before the operation commenced. He spoke with engineers, forward observers, and the commanders of the panzer divisions who would be leading the charge. These conversations revealed a growing unease among the field commanders about the scale of the obstacles ahead. They reported an almost unbelievable proliferation of mines, barbed wire, and new, deep anti-tank trenches dug across the salient. The preliminary reconnaissance had confirmed the existence of multiple defensive belts, a fact that deeply concerned the veteran commander. Guderian personally viewed sections of the forward Soviet positions through field glasses and visited the areas where the attacks would commence. He could plainly see the meticulous preparation and the sheer depth of the obstacles that lay between the starting lines and the Soviet objectives. The terrain itself was not conducive to the rapid, fluid movements of the blitzkrieg that Guderian had perfected. His experience told him that the time spent clearing minefields and overcoming such deep defenses would be time lost forever. Lost time meant giving the Soviets more opportunities to bring up their reserves and launch their own powerful counterattacks against stalled forces. The sight of the endless, freshly turned earth and the reported density of the mines left a deeply negative impression on the Inspector General. He did not need theoretical calculations. The grim reality of the defensive construction was laid bare before his professional military eye. The general's growing apprehension was founded on the physical evidence of the Soviet Union's immense investment in this particular piece of front. Guderian's inspection was not merely a glance at a map, it included a grim tour of the forward positions and actual approaches to the Soviet lines. He witnessed firsthand the immense challenge that his panzer divisions would face in simply beginning their planned attack. The area was a continuous, overlapping series of obstacles, making it fundamentally different from previous, less prepared Soviet defenses. The minefields, in particular, were not isolated patches but vast, interconnected zones that extended for kilometers. Engineers spoke of the difficulty in even locating and clearing the mines, which were often laid in deep, staggered patterns to foil conventional clearing techniques. The German mine-clearing equipment was not fully adequate for this scale of layered defense, a critical logistical failure. Every meter gained would be paid for by a deliberate, time-consuming effort that exposed the engineering detachments to concentrated fire. The sheer volume of explosives meant that the path of the advancing tanks would inevitably be littered with the wreckage of mine-struck vehicles. The minefields would act as a powerful force multiplier for the Soviet artillery, essentially freezing the German armor in place for targeting. Guderian understood that the loss of momentum in an armored offensive is tantamount to the complete failure of the operation's central premise. He saw the inevitable bottlenecks, the tragic concentration of tanks that would occur as they tried to funnel through cleared lanes. These lanes would, in turn, become predictable targets for the Soviet gunners who waited patiently in their deep, camouflaged bunkers. The Inspector General was observing the deliberate, systematic deconstruction of the very tactical advantage he had spent his career creating. The minefields were a silent, inanimate enemy that promised to chew up the German tanks without ever being engaged in a direct fight. The landscape was a testament to the fact that the Germans had entirely lost the element of surprise in the critical sector of the Eastern Front. The cumulative effect of the inspection was a profound sense of pessimism and professional foreboding for General Guderian. He had come to assess readiness, but he left with an unshakable conviction that the operation was fundamentally flawed in its conception and timing. The general's famous bluntness was never more evident than in the subsequent debriefings and discussions with his senior colleagues. His experience in the rapid campaigns of the West made the static, attritional nature of the Kursk salient's defenses an anathema to him. He knew that committing the precious core of Germany's remaining armored strength to this grinding, positional warfare was a catastrophic error. Guderian recognized that the Soviet defenses were not a hastily assembled barrier but a fully mature, layered, and integrated combat system. He correctly assessed that the immense density of the minefields alone was sufficient to negate the qualitative advantages of the new German tanks. The Tiger and Panther tanks were superior in armor and firepower, but they were no less susceptible to a concealed mine than a light tank. Once disabled by a mine, the superior tank became a fixed, immobile target for destruction by the heavy Soviet anti-tank guns. The Inspector General understood the strategic implications. The immense expenditure of men and material would yield no lasting, breakthrough victory. Instead, the Wehrmacht would only succeed in weakening itself against the powerful counteroffensives that the Soviets were undoubtedly holding in reserve. The realization of this grim reality led Guderian to confront the political and military leadership with his unambiguous concerns. He was not merely offering a suggestion but delivering a serious, professional warning from the field of battle itself. The German High Command was choosing to bleed their most valuable assets in a protracted battle of material attrition, a game they could no longer win. Guderian's task as Inspector General compelled him to speak this unwelcome truth, regardless of the political cost to himself. The Soviet defensive system was revolutionary in its adherence to the principle of depth and successive staging. It was composed of several interwoven defensive belts, each separated by significant distances to frustrate and absorb the German thrusts. The first belt was primarily designed to disorganize the assault, utilizing heavy minefields and forward observation posts. The second and third belts were the main lines of resistance, packed with infantry, fortified trenches, and the bulk of the anti-tank weaponry. Beyond these primary lines lay deep strategic reserves, including powerful tank armies, poised for the decisive counterstroke. This depth meant that even a successful, albeit costly, breach of the first line would only bring the attacking force into contact with an equally formidable obstacle. The German plan required not one, but multiple simultaneous breakthroughs to maintain the necessary speed of the armored Schwerpunkt. The lack of reserves on the German side meant that a gradual attrition across these multiple lines would quickly exhaust their offensive capacity. The Soviet engineers had created a network of fire that was designed to catch the German tanks from multiple directions as they advanced slowly. The anti-tank ditches were massive, often deep enough to overturn the heaviest tanks, and were sited to overlap their fields of fire. Guderian understood that the tactical brilliance of the German junior officers and the quality of their tanks could not overcome this systemic obstacle. The depth of the Soviet deployment nullified the very essence of the blitzkrieg strategy, forcing a slow, methodical advance. The Inspector General recognized that the enemy was not merely defending but actively setting a highly lethal trap for the attacking forces. The Soviet army had learned the painful lessons of 1941 and 1942, adapting their defensive strategy to counter the German armored superiority. This massive defensive geometry was a sign that the war was irrevocably changing from one of maneuver to one of brute force and massive defense. Following his inspection, Guderian immediately returned to the highest command levels to articulate his devastating assessment. He famously voiced his profound concerns regarding the operation directly to Field Marshal von Kluge and other senior figures. His central argument was simple and unyielding: the immense Soviet defenses had already absorbed the value of the offensive before a single shot was fired. The delays had given the Soviets the necessary time to construct a defense that was simply too deep and too mine-laden to overcome without crippling losses. Guderian argued that the offensive would merely sacrifice the essential armored reserves needed to counter future Soviet offensives. He warned that once the attack stalled, the Germans would have nothing left to hold the vast fronts that stretched across Eastern Europe. The specific, oft-quoted saying, summarizing his professional horror upon seeing the minefields, became a historical marker of his foresight. Guderian asked the poignant and fatalistic question to his colleagues: did it really have to be done, or why did you not attack sooner? He also recorded his blunt, direct assessment that attacking the Russian defenses was a monumental and pointless waste of men and material. The Inspector General made it clear that the attack was predictable, delayed, and would result in an irreparable strategic hemorrhage for the Wehrmacht. This prophetic warning was met with the inertia and misplaced optimism of the High Command, who were unwilling to challenge Hitler's operational directive. Von Kluge, in particular, was more concerned with the political fallout of cancelling the operation than the strategic reality on the ground. Guderian's counsel was ultimately disregarded in favor of the momentum of the existing plan and the perceived need for a major, morale-boosting victory. His words were a stark, clear-eyed recognition that the strategic balance of power had already shifted irrevocably in favor of the Soviet Union. The refusal to heed his warning became a tragic premonition of the final, desperate struggle that would consume the German military machine. The reality of Operation Citadel, when it commenced, brutally confirmed Guderian's direst professional predictions. The German armored formations immediately ran up against the massive, integrated system of Soviet anti-tank defenses. The advance was agonizingly slow, measured in meters per hour rather than kilometers per day, a pace fatal to an armored offensive. The density of the minefields proved insurmountable, forcing the German engineers to clear lanes under intense and relentless enemy fire. These cleared lanes quickly became killing funnels where the concentrated Soviet artillery and anti-tank rifles inflicted terrible casualties. The powerful new Panther and Tiger tanks, intended to be the spearhead of the breakthrough, were immobilized by mines or anti-tank ditches. Once bogged down, these superior fighting vehicles were destroyed by sustained, coordinated fire from the deep Soviet defensive positions. The infantry, trying to support the tanks, were mired in the deep trench systems and decimated by continuous machine gun and mortar fire. The element of surprise was non-existent, and the initial massive assault quickly devolved into a grinding, slow-motion battle of attrition. The German forces were unable to maintain the speed and cohesion necessary to penetrate the successive belts of Soviet resistance. Each small gain was bought at an unsustainable cost in tanks and trained personnel, assets that Germany could no longer easily replace. The Soviet defenders fought with grim efficiency, utilizing their prepared positions to maximum effect against the exposed German forces. Guderian's fear that the Panzer Arm would be shattered against a wall of explosives and earth was becoming a devastating reality on the open steppes. The battle for Kursk was demonstrating, in the most violent and conclusive way possible, the end of the blitzkrieg era on the Eastern Front. Operation Citadel was formally abandoned by Hitler less than 2 weeks after its initial launch, a clear admission of its strategic failure. The German forces had failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough on either the northern or the southern face of the salient. The immense minefields and the depth of the Soviet defenses had successfully consumed the bulk of the German offensive power. The Wehrmacht suffered crippling losses in men and, critically, in the irreplaceable tanks of the new Tiger and Panther models. The losses were not merely tactical but represented the permanent depletion of Germany's capacity to launch any future large-scale armored offensives in the east. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, which had briefly flickered during the planning of Citadel, was permanently ceded to the Soviet Union. The Soviet counteroffensives, launched immediately after the German attack stalled, quickly pushed the exhausted German forces onto the defensive. The entire balance of power had shifted from a German strategic offense to a desperate and prolonged German strategic defense. Guderian's earlier assessment that the operation would destroy the Panzer Arm for no meaningful gain proved tragically accurate. The fate of Citadel was sealed not only by the Soviet tanks but by the silent, lethal efficacy of the deep defensive positions and the massive mine belts. The fields of Kursk became the graveyard for the offensive spirit of the German army, confirming the final, irreversible momentum of the war. The failure was a profound strategic blow, forcing Germany into a long, agonizing retreat that would not end until the fall of Berlin. The war of maneuver, which Guderian had championed, was over, replaced by a brutal war of continuous, back-breaking attrition. The aftermath of Kursk marked the beginning of the long, inevitable strategic retreat of the German army across the vast plains of the Soviet Union. Guderian's role became even more critical as he focused on rebuilding and managing the shattered remnants of the German armored forces. His previous warnings about conserving the panzers for defensive operations now took on a desperate, urgent relevance. The Inspector General was tasked with a nearly impossible job: to equip and train enough armored divisions to stem the relentless tide of Soviet attacks. He often clashed with Hitler over the need to retreat to more defensible lines and the futility of holding every piece of ground. Guderian's experience at Kursk had cemented his belief that tactical retreats were essential to preserve force and maintain strategic elasticity. The Soviet Union, now fully capable of mounting massive, coordinated offensives, relentlessly pushed the Germans westward. The German High Command was forever haunted by the memory of the Kursk minefields, the point where the tide of the war had irreversibly turned. The failure of Operation Citadel made all subsequent German actions in the East reactionary, dictated by Soviet initiative and power. Guderian's famous quote, "All the sentiment behind it," serves as a powerful testament to the military professional's clear-eyed understanding of reality. It was an acknowledgement that the German military was no longer fighting on its own terms but was being consumed by the strength of the enemy's defense. The vast, silent minefields of Kursk stood as a monument to the end of German offensive dominance and the true beginning of the Soviet victory. The final years of the war were a desperate echo of the mistake Guderian witnessed and warned against in the summer of 1943.